Do you know the difference between a villain and an antagonist? If not, stay tuned. What's up, everybody? This is Jay Carver, and today we're going to be talking about the main difference between a villain and an antagonist in your story. So normally, if you ask anybody the difference between a villain and an antagonist, you'll get anything from random answers to a blank stare. When you hear the word villain, you typically think of someone with a pointy mustache, an evil wizard, a mad scientist, or someone who just has an evil plan. There's a reason for that too. Let's start with a couple of definitions from Google though to get us on the right track. A villain is a character whose actions and motives are important to the plot. Now, plot is the key word we need to remember here when we think about villains. An antagonist, on the other hand, is a person who opposes or is hostile to someone or something, like an adversary. Remember this, villains are always antagonists, but antagonists aren't necessarily always villains. The antagonist isn't necessarily always evil either. They simply just have opposing actions, thoughts, or motives that are in contrast with the protagonist. Now, when we think about what an antagonist actually is, we want to think in terms of an adversary, an opponent, a competitor, a rival, or an enemy. So the antagonist doesn't even have to be human also, so keep that in mind. So a ghost or supernatural force, a tornado or some type of world event that's happening, or even society or technology like in the Matrix could be an antagonistic force or element. Let's talk about a few examples of movies that we're familiar with. In the movie Scarface, the antagonist was Sosa. He was more like a competitor somewhat, but he wasn't a villain with an evil plan. Remember Creed Part 2? Victor Drago was the antagonist, not a villain. They were competing for the same goal. In the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks, where he was stuck on the island and his whole environment was more like the antagonistic force. If we take the movie The Birds that Hitchcock did back in the day, the birds were more like an antagonistic force also. There wasn't some villain with an evil plan that was controlling those birds and creating all this chaos. In the movie Gravity, where Sandra Bullock was stuck in space, all of that space debris and her whole situation was more like an antagonistic force. Another example would be Duck Phillips in Mad Men. That was Draper's antagonist. Now, when we get into examples for villains, it's more about a moral choice. Darth Vader in Star Wars was more of a villain. Could be argued that he was also a villain as well as an antagonist, but if we just take the very first Star Wars on its own, he was more of a villain. In the movie Black Panther, Killmonger was a villain also. It could also be argued that he was an antagonist as well as a villain, but for the most part, he was primarily a villain. Remember the Terminator? Straight up villain. Killed anybody that looked at him sideways, blew stuff up. He did anything he had to do in order to get to his target. And if we jump into the Marvel universe with Avengers, the Endgame, Thanos was the villain. Another good example is Hans Gruber from the movie Die Hard when he took over the Nakatomi building. So to wrap things up, an antagonist equals opposition. A villain equals opposition, but just happens to be an asshole. Does that make sense? Regardless of which one you choose to go in your story, both are there to escalate the conflict. And while we're talking about conflict, keep this quote in mind by Sid Field. Without conflict, there's no action. And without action, there's no character. Without character, there is no story. And without story, there's no damn screenplay. So I hope this helped. Hope you got something out of this. If you did, make sure to leave me a comment below, hit the like button, subscribe. It definitely helps out the YouTube algorithm, and I appreciate it. Peace. All right, before you go, make sure you jump on the mailing list so you can get your free screenwriter's checklist, which will help you before, during, and after your next big script. And you will also get a link to a free filmmaker's glossary, which gives you some insight on the basic terms used in the film industry. Oh yeah, and before I forget, if you're on the fence or struggling with any new movie ideas, or you're just questioning if the idea that you do have is strong enough, make sure you check out the ebook that I wrote on how to write stronger story concepts, themes, and log lines. And as usual, don't forget to hit that like button and leave me a comment. All right? Peace.